Our new game camera class will for now only get one custom method, which we will use to set certain constraints for our camera. So for example, that we can't pan over the borders of our scene. Let's create a new method called setConstraints, which will get the following parameters. One parameter called scene of type skScene, one parameter frame of type CGRect, and another parameter node of type skNode. And this last parameter will be optional, since we will not always use it. A few things like this node parameter are also not really necessary for our panning constraints we are now going to add. But since we are going to use them later on, we can already put them into the method, so that later on we won't have to change everything. For now, I want to specify constraints for the camera that will stop it from showing stuff that's not in our tile map, like the empty scene background, for example. To do so, I will need two values from the parameters of my method. One is the scaled size of our scene, and one is the frame containing all our visual elements in the map. I will save the first in a constant called scaled size, which will be initialized with a CGSize instance. And for the width, I will say scene.size.width times xScale. xScale will in this case be the current scale of our camera node itself, which we do have to factor in for our scene, since this is ultimately what we are seeing. The scale of a camera node basically is the zoom factor, so how much we've zoomed in or out on our scene. For the height, I will do the same thing, this time with scene.size.height times y-scale. Next will be a constant called board content rect, which I will just set to frame, so the parameter that we get passed here. This frame will later contain the frame of our tilemap node, which, if you remember correctly, contains our whole level. Now that I have these two values, I can start figuring out where the borders and edges of our level are, which I then don't want to allow my camera to pass. We already know that our camera is position centered, so the position of our camera should always be limited to a distance of half the camera frame in relation to the edge, if we don't want to see anything that comes after this edge. To achieve this, I will now define x and y insets that define this distance from our borders. Let's create a constant called xInset, which I will set to the minimum of two passed values. I can do so by using min in Swift, which I can then pass two values to, and this will just return the smaller one of those two. I now want to add scaled size.width divided by 2. The division by 2 is again because our camera is in the middle. And for the second value, I will say board content rect.width divided by 2. So what I'm doing here is comparing my scaled width divided by 2 and the complete frame's width divided by 2. And I would then use the smaller of the two values for my constant xInset. Exactly the same will be done for a constant yInset, with the min value of either scaled size.height divided by 2 or board content rect.height divided by 2. Alright, we now have the inset which our camera's position should not pass. So to make sure we keep it on our map at all times, I will now use these two insets to create a rectangle based on the complete frame of our map, and then just drawing this new inset rectangle inside of it, and this will be where our camera is allowed to move in. I will create a new constant called inset content rect. which I will set to board content rect.insetBy. This method will then take a x and y inset, where I can just use my constants from above. So x inset and y inset. This convenient method will then just create a new rectangle that is inset with the appropriate values. And our camera should then somehow be constrained to stay inside of this rectangle. If the camera stays inside of this rectangle, the distance to the border of our map will always be at least half the camera's frame. So we will never see the scene's background, which is exactly what we want. But how do we add such a constraint to our camera node? Well, we're going to use so-called ranges for this. One for the X position to the left and right, and for the Y position, so up and down on our screen. I can use the min and max values of my inset content rect for the upper and lower bounds of these ranges. I'll begin with a constant called xRange, an SK range with a lower and upper limit. For this xRange, I will of course pass inset content rect.minx and inset content rect.maxx for the parameters. I can then create a constant called yRange with an SK range with the lower limit inset content rect.min_y and the upper limit inset content rect.maxy. I can then use these ranges in a SpriteKit constraint, which we are able to set for our camera node. To do so, let's create a constant called level edge constraint, and it will be a SK constraint where I want to constrain my position to a X as well as a Y range. So we choose this one here. For the parameters, we will then obviously pass the X range and Y range constants that we just created. This constraint will now only allow the node it is set to be positioned inside of these ranges, so that our camera should not be able to move close to the borders of our map where we could see beyond it. But we still have to add the constraint, and we will do so by setting the constraint property on our game camera. This will always be an array of SK constraints. So even though we only have one, I'll need to write it in square brackets, where I will of course just add the level edge constraint. And that's it. If we now call this method with the appropriate parameters, we should not be able to move our camera beyond our map. This should of course be done from our actual game scene, where we have the values we need to pass, such as the frame and scene. So back in our game scene, I will go to my add camera method, and I now will, just after setting my game camera as the camera of our game, write game camera dot set constraints, where I will now have to define a scene, a rectangle, and an optional node. We already have the scene, which is just our game scene itself. The node won't be needed here, so we can pass nil. But for the frame, we will now need the frame property of our tilemap node. I do not yet have this value, so that's what we need to do first. I will quickly check my game scene file, where I can select my tilemap node and check its name, which is tilemap node. I will copy this name and then go back into my Swift file. To be able to access my tilemap, I will start by adding a new property to the class right above my existing properties. It will be a variable called mapNode, initialized as an empty SK tilemap node, and we will override this value in a second. I just want to provide a default value so that I don't have to use an optional or need an initializer in my game scene. I will then create a new custom method inside of which I will for now only set the value for my map node. I will call this new method setUpLevel and it will not have any parameters. I now want to call this method first thing in my didMoveToView method at the top, since it will later on contain all of the code needed to initialize and set up our whole level, basically. But for now, I will only get a reference to my tile map by writing if that map node is child node with name, and I will obviously paste the tile map node's name that I just copied from the SKS file. Then I want to cast this as an SK tile map node, and if I do get a value here, I will just set self.mapNode to this value, so that we now have a mapNode property in our class, which we can use to access our tile map node from the SKS file. Since I will actually use this mapNode property in my addCamera method, I will just cut the addCamera call from didMoveToView and paste it right below. Setting the mapNode property in the setupLevel method, I just want to make sure that this actually holds the right value when calling addCamera. Inside of the addCamera method, I can then complete my setConstraints call. For the scene, I will pass self, so our game scene itself. The rect will be mapNode.frame, so the frame of our tile map node. And for the node, like I said, we will pass nil, since we don't need it. And that should be it for keeping our camera on the map. So let's run the app again, ideally on a device, so we can see this with a smooth frame rate and we don't have to worry about that. The app started, and when I now pan and try to move beyond my tile map, it doesn't work anymore. I can see that I can move the camera exactly to the borders of my map node, but not any further. So this works like a charm. I can then stop the app, and we now want to implement our second gesture recognizer, which will be a pinch recognizer, so that we can also zoom in and out of our scene to be able to get a good overview of our level later on.